preparation of the kids and participation. And I've done that sort of thing. This next month makes 30 years, the Lord willing, that we've been where we're located. I have done young people's classes on Sunday evenings. We do that the year round, except we break from Thanksgiving till after New Year's Day. And I've often said that that's, in my opinion, one of the best investments of time we could possibly make. And so I do treasure that time. So it was good to have that opportunity to teach the young people's class. And thank you, boys and girls, young men and young ladies, for taking part in that. And the good songs selected tonight, and good job in leading those as well in participation. It's just a joy to be with you. I treasure and I appreciate every opportunity that I have to teach the gospel of Christ. I consider it a very solemn responsibility, and yet I consider it a great joy. I love what I do. And to be with people that are wanting to know more about the Scriptures and to allow me to help in some way, I'm just delighted to do that. What we're doing in this series, as we said this morning, we're really covering the theme of the Bible, but we're using visuals, and so we call this a visualized survey of the Bible. And we gave the setting and background of the biblical world this morning, and then we started in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, and where we left off was at Mount Sinai, and that's where we're going to take up in just a moment. But I would say, as before we specifically mention Sinai, just a couple of things to remember from the lesson this morning. One was, you will recall, that we focused on Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, that first promise to bring Christ into the world. That God said to Satan, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. That's the first promise of this seed of woman that would come to give victory over Satan, over sin, and over death. And so that's a very important passage. But then we also saw that Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12, was given three very important promises. God promised to make of him a great nation and to give him the land of Canaan. And in thy seed shall all families of the earth be blessed. That third one, as we mentioned this morning, being the same as Genesis 3:15 in different words, but it's that seed of Abraham, that coming Christ. Paul will comment on that in the New Testament in the book of Galatians chapter 3, and he will say, he saith not seeds as of many, but seed as of one, which is Christ. So clearly, it is a prophecy of the Christ to come. But we didn't get there this morning as far as fulfillment was concerned, but we did start on the fulfillment of those promises by noticing that God did make of Israel a great nation. There are numerous people, and at Mount Sinai, the book of Numbers tells about the numbering. That's why it's called the book of Numbers. But it tells about the numbering of the men of war, which, as you will recall, was 603,550 men of war. And so that's just the men of war, those 20 years and older, and not counting the tribe of Levi. So God has made them a numerous people, but the great nation promise was not just they were a numerous people, but they were God's chosen people, and He was in their midst. That's what made them great. And so what happens at Mount Sinai, God enters into covenant relationship with them in terms of that Mosaic law that we just mentioned this morning. God gave the law through Moses, and the other laws and ordinances besides the Ten Commandments. And the people said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And so animal sacrifices were offered, and blood was sprinkled upon the people and upon the covenant. And so that's very important, and that's involved in the nation promise, not just the counting of the people, but their special covenant relationship with the Lord. But that came to pass where we left off in our study this morning. We were at the foothills of Sinai. Moses ascended Mount Sinai. This is the traditional location of that particular mount in a very, very rugged area. This is an aerial view of the mount from the Biblical Archaeology Review to show you again at the very top. But again, it's in this area that Israel at the foot of the mountain was encamped. And during this time, as we saw this morning, three things happened, including the building of the tabernacle, the giving of the law and the ordination of the priesthood. Been privileged to look at a model of the tabernacle which is built to scale. And where this is in the desert, located at, well, it's just north of the Red Sea, near Eilat. And as I say, this is built to scale. And just to give you a kind of a feel for the tabernacle, you see the exterior here. And you can see, for example, this doesn't get enough field of view to show you the altar, which was to your left. But you can see here the laver and where you would have entered the first compartments, the first compartment. And also some men that are standing there give you a feel for the scale there. But we'll step inside, and we're looking here in the model at the holy place. And you'll recognize what you're seeing here. You'll see on your left-hand side the lampstand. There's one stand, but it had 7 lamps on it on your left. And to your right, you'll see the table of showbread, and there were 6 loaves of bread here. The showbread representing each of the 6 on each side, a total of 12, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. You can see in the back the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place behind the veil. And you also see 2 men that the garments here have been made based on the description that we have in the Scriptures. The garments of the priest on the left and the high priest on your right. I want to do a close-up and show you the breastplate that the high priest would have worn. And there are 12 stones on the breastplate. And each of these has the name of the tribe of Israel. And in fact, that's every one of these are showing the tribes. All 12 are counted there. And that would be what the priest was wearing. And what you don't see would also be the Urim and Thummim that was there. So again, all this took place in that 11-month period where we ended our lesson this morning when they were at Mount Sinai. As we go behind the veil, this is what you would see. And you would not, if you could go behind the veil, this is what you could see. Because, of course, it was only the high priest once a year that went behind the veil. But there was the Ark of the Covenant, there was the mercy seat, and the Bible says that there were 2 cherubim with their wings spread out facing one another, with their wings touching one another. So again, this has been built to scale and in showing the description that is given in the Scriptures. The Jews had a name for this. They called it the Shekinah, which represented the very presence of God. And this, of course, you're in the most holy place. Again, only the high priest on the Day of Atonement, 7th month, 10th day of the year, would come and offer sacrifices, bring the blood of animal sacrifices here, first for himself and then for the people. So this was very important. This was made to be portable, and it could move as Israel needed to move. Later, of course, it will be replaced in the days of Solomon with the temple. But now it's time to go. And so what happens is, starting in verse 11 of Numbers, the 10th chapter, we head out. But by the time we get to chapter 11, the people start murmuring. And they've been murmuring all along. When I say they started murmuring, they've already been murmuring. It's just that now that they resume the journey, they start murmuring again. And so God sent fire that destroyed them, many of them. And that's why the place was called Taberah. It means burning. And then they went on further, and they were complaining because they didn't have the kind of food they wanted. And many died there, and that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, which means graves of lust. They were saying things like this: "Oh, back in Egypt, man, it was so good back in Egypt. We just had it made. We could eat all we wanted. And all we've got here in the wilderness is this old yucky manna." And they were just forgetting their special purpose and the fact that, yes, for the time being they were in the wilderness, but God was taking them to the promised land. And it wasn't all that many days. Of course, it's easy for us, as was mentioned in the prayer this evening. It's air-conditioned in here. We're not marching in burning sand. And, we're not in that same situation. But nevertheless, God was not pleased. And the New Testament will look back and talk about their unbelief and their murmuring. God was very displeased with them in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. And by the way, in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, Paul says, "Neither be ye murmurers as they murmured." So, do you know it's a sin to murmur? But anyway, by the way, these were fish that I photographed in Alexandria of Egypt to give you a feel for some of the fish that they might have eaten. So that's what they're talking about. And again, God was very displeased. But then after many died, again because of plague and because of their murmuring, they continued and they passed through a place that is called Hazeroth. And I'm making use here of a photo by Todd Mauldin as credited here for this particular area as they're making their way toward the destination, which is going to be Kadesh Barnea. And Deuteronomy chapter 1 will make this point, and quoting from the NET Bible, it's ordinarily an 11-day journey from Horeb is Mount Sinai, to Kadesh Barnea. So ordinarily, a couple weeks of travel is all you're talking about to get us from this point here at Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea where they were. So they're in that position, and from here they sent out the spies, 12 of them, one from each tribe, to bring back a report of the land, of the cities, of its produce, that sort of thing. And so they all waited, and the men came back, 12 of them. And they said, well, it's a great land, just like we've been told. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. And they showed these big clusters of grapes. They showed some of the produce of the land. But then 10 out of the 12 said, but we can't take it because the walls of the cities, we can't scale those walls. And they're giants in the land. In fact, all the people are giants, and we were like grasshoppers in their sight and in our sight. And Joshua and Caleb said, don't talk that way. These people don't have anything. Our God is with us. Let us go up at once and possess it. But they wouldn't listen. Now, I mentioned the 3,550 men that had been counted. Now, the 12 spies were part of that. And all of them. Everybody listens to the majority report. They're even talking, they're crying, and they're talking about stoning Moses and appointing another leader and going back to Egypt. And at that point, that's when God came down. And he had tolerated, he had been merciful, he had extended time and opportunity, but he said no more. He said, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness for the next 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had spied out the land. Now I'm summarizing Numbers chapters 13 and 14. So what happened is when Moses put it that way, then the people changed their tune. Oh, well, if it's going to be that way, okay, we're ready, we'll go up now. And Moses says, no, don't go up. It's too late. The Lord is not with you now. But the text says, and here's the text, it says in Numbers 14, verse 44, it says, but the people presumed to go up. Now, when you act without Bible authority, there's a word for that. The word is presumption. They were disobedient. The text says they presumed to go up. That means they did what God had not authorized them to do. And so here's what happened. They went up and they're going to fight anyway. And the text says that they were beaten back down to Hormah. So what happens is we're in that period of wandering here. And we call it wandering not because they're just lost, but they would have to move depending upon where there's vegetation. But they're in the wilderness of Sinai, and they're going to be there for this 40-year period. Actually, the way it counts is year number 1 it counts to get them to that point. There's going to be really 38 years of wandering, and then the 40th year is when they're getting in position to take the land. And so that's how those 40 years are actually broken in Scripture. So here we have it. This is the scene of Kadesh Barnea, and again with all the desert around and the rugged, rocky areas, you can see if there's greenery, there's water there. So that would be one of the places that they encamped. But they were at other locations as well. Now Moses will look back at the end of that period. See, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1 at verse 3, it's going to say that Moses spoke to the people in the 11th month of the 40th year. So you're in that 40th year with just 2 months to go when the book begins. So he's going to look back in these speeches he makes in Deuteronomy 8 and verse 15, he'll say, listen, these are the survivors. Those men of war now have died that were numbered originally. And so then there's a second numbering, 601,730 to be exact in the second numbering. But now, so Moses is speaking to them. It's the children of those that were disobedient. And he's saying, you need to remember some things. And in this period in the wilderness, God led you through that great and terrible wilderness in which were fiery serpents. Fiery serpents are not like chicken snakes. They're not like black snakes. Fiery serpents are venomous snakes. They're poisonous snakes, and you'll die if you're bitten by them. And so he led you where there were fiery serpents and scorpions and a thirsty land where there was no water. But in the context, he's saying God took care of you. He fed you. He gave you water. Your clothes didn't wear out. Your feet didn't swell. God took care of you. And so he's saying what you'd better be mindful of is your covenant with God. Don't let anything turn you aside, but you think about what God did. But to be there is to see what Moses is talking about. I mean, this is a rugged wilderness. It's a dry and thirsty wilderness. It is barren. And I mean, you'll see those acacia trees here and there. You'll see those palm trees here and there. But as a peninsula, it's really rugged country. And I'm just showing you some of the views that you can see of that. But in that 40th year, now it's time for them to go up. And what they're going to do is they're going to be poised on the eastern side, right on this side of the, coming on up a little further, right up here. That's where they're going to be poised to take the land later. When they were coming up to Edom's territory and wanting to use the King's Highway, which is the best highway, Edom turned them back. And so in the more rugged Arabah, they made their way up to the Zered and circumvented around Moab. And it's really quite an experience to go through that Arabah. This is that part of that great rift we were talking about this morning, south of the Dead Sea as it goes on down. But just to give you one shot right here, this is facing to the west, but this is that great rift, and it's like this for miles, except it's rugged, it's up and down. But this is the way that they made their way on up to the eastern side. But as they're making their way up, though, there's a king in the southern part of Canaan, the king of Arad. This is Numbers 21. Could I just make this brief note that will help you about this wandering period? When you get to Numbers 20, you're in the 40th year. So Numbers 20 through 36 is in that 40th year. I've already mentioned as the book of Deuteronomy begins, you're by then the 11th month of the 40th year. Now, Numbers 20 doesn't say 40th year there, but Numbers 35 looks back to the events that happened in Numbers 20, and that tells you it was the 20th year. So the 40th year in the 20th chapter. So in Numbers 21, here they are, they're making their way up, and a king from southern Canaan, the king of Arad, he went down to where Israel was, and he took several Israelites captive. And this is at Arad. Let me show you where that is. This right in the center of the photo, this is the Arad that is mentioned in Scripture. And Israel prayed to God about it, and God allowed them to take the captives back, and they destroyed the city here. But meanwhile, as I say, they're getting around south of here, moving left, making the way on up to, as I mentioned a while ago, being poised on the eastern side. And from here, that's where they're eventually going to go in. You recognize Jericho is right there. But what happens is, Sihon, king of the Amorites, that was a tribe that you see really on both sides of the Jordan. The Amorites were on the western side as well. But Sihon of this area on the eastern side of the Jordan, he attacked Israel. Israel fought a defensive battle. God gave them victory. That's not a part of the original land promise. And it mentions at this time in Numbers 21 that Israel captured all the cities of the Amorites, including, it says, Heshbon. And when it'll mention something like Heshbon, that's because this was a strategic city or maybe the more important city. And Heshbon is one of those places that was inhabited for a long time. Archaeologists have uncovered 20 layers of occupation here at Heshbon. So this is the city that is mentioned specifically in part of the territory of Sihon, king of the Amorites. But then it tells us next that Og, king of Bashan to the north, also came out against Israel. Now, again, Israel is not on the offensive, but they are forced to take a defensive posture here. And so when they're attacked, they do defend themselves, and God gives them victory. And so now you have, this is the land of Og of Bashan, so now you have all this eastern side that was occupied by these two kings, Sihon to the south and Og to the north, and now Israel has all of that land. Now that's important because later, with the division of the land, 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, will settle on this side. But that wasn't part of the original land promise, but it was also given to them as things turned out. Now, in the mix of this, another thing happens. You know, as we say, the plot thickens. There's another king nearby. We mentioned the Amorites, and we mentioned Og, king of Bashan to the north. But Balak, who was king of the Moabites, starts getting nervous. Even though Israel has not been the attacker, he's thinking, Israel's going to take our land too. And so what he does is to send to get Balaam of Pethor, and Numbers 22 tells about that, which is near to the river. And he asks him to come and curse this people. And that means to pronounce a curse of calamity, that they would be defeated in battle. And Balaam at first, you know, he's one of these that knows how to say the right thing, but his heart wasn't in it. Well, I can't go beyond the word of the Lord. You know, I just have to say what he would say. And God said, don't go. So he said, I can't go. So more messengers are sent. And then let me see what more the Lord may say. The New Testament mentions Balaam, and it talks about him as loving the hire of unrighteousness. And so it was greed, it was covetousness that motivated him to do the thing he knew God didn't want him to do. But every time he opened his mouth to curse the people in Numbers chapters 23, 24, as the narrative continues, a blessing would come out. And so it turned out he wasn't benefited at all. And so what happens next in the book of Deuteronomy is that Israel is assembled in the plains of Abel Shittim. This would have been some of the land of Moab. And this is where, and I was so glad the reading of Deuteronomy 6 was selected this evening, and I know that was no doubt done on purpose as it would tie in with the lesson. But this is where Moses said some of the words that we read a while ago from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Moses gathered all of Israel, and he said, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. When you sit, when you walk, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And so that's the thrust of it, to remember God, remember your covenant with Him, and don't get over there in the land and forsake God and be attracted to these false gods. And if you do that, He will cast you out of this land that He will give you. So really, Moses is now 120 years old. And the book of Deuteronomy, really the way it happens is this. There are 4 major speeches. And then Moses will ascend Mount Nebo, and he will look over and see the promised land. Then he will die. And then the last 30 days is spent mourning for Moses. And then in Joshua 1, you're in the first month of the 41st year when the narrative continues. So here we are. We're going to ascend with Moses to Mount Nebo. And here we are at Mount Nebo. And from this position, I'm capturing the edge of Nebo here. We're on Mount Nebo. You can see some of the mountain here on your far left. What you see the body of water there, that's the Dead Sea. We saw the Dead Sea this morning from the other side. But we're looking across and we're seeing the land of Israel, and he could just, on a clear day, it says he could just see everything from this perspective, from Mount Nebo. And then he descended and he died, and the Lord buried him. But then, as I mentioned, next we come to the next Bible period, which is the invasion and the conquest. And Israel was in this area ready to cross over. I say that because we're looking toward Jericho, but we're back to the east of the Jordan River where Israel would have been. And so now we make our way to the Jordan, where the Jericho is going to be the first city that is taken. So we make our way and we cross the Jordan, except though we're at the spot that this happened, at the time the text tells us that it was at flood stage. Of course, when I took this photo, the Jordan was not flooded. but I take it at this point because this is the location where they cross, right in this area. And so crossing, you go up the banks of the Jordan, and this is what it looks like. We're just walking with Israel. We're journeying with them, and now we're facing Jericho. Now first they'll go to Gilgal. There the males would be circumcised that had not been. They're going to observe the Passover. But then they continue from Gilgal. They make their way on to Jericho. And we're at a higher point of elevation. We can look down, and I can show you what's in the center, upper center here, the bare spot. That is the tell of Jericho. And we go down on ground level where you can see some of the excavation that has been done. This was the first city, and it was totally devoted to the Lord, but this was the first city of Israel that they took. It was a very important city. It kind of guarded the entrance into the land of Canaan. And so the walls fell by faith in Joshua chapter 6. Next, Ai and Bethel were taken. This is a photograph of the place that's been identified as Bethel, which today is called Beitin. And once that was taken, then they made their way in Joshua chapter 8. In obedience to what God said, they made their way to Shechem. And at Mount Ebal, they erected 12 stones and plastered them with plaster, and all the words of the law were written on those stones. Also an altar was made that would just be used for that occasion. But here coming from the south is what they saw. They were coming here from the south on their way to Shechem, which is in the center. To your right is Mount Ebal. To your left is Mount Gerizim. And here's what God said to do. Shechem is right in between. On the slopes of Mount Ebal, there were 6 tribes to be gathered, and on Gerizim 6 tribes to be gathered. And down below, all the words of the law were read, the curses and the blessings. And all the people said, Amen. Now, put this, Joshua chapter 8, with Genesis chapter 12. Because it's Genesis 12 and verse 6 that Abraham arrived at Shechem. And verse 7, God said, I'll give you the land. How many children did Abraham have then? Well, he was childless. It was just Abraham and Sarah. Now then, these years later, in obedience to God's commands, they've gone to the very place that Abraham was when the promise was given, now to receive the promise and to again affirm their covenant relationship with the Lord. They could have done this anywhere, but God said to do it here because this is where the promise was made. Now here they are to receive the land, again, based on their covenant relationship with God. Isn't that special? And again, now that childless couple of Genesis 12, the descendants here are numbered. The males who were in the men of war that were numbered are 601,730, plus the tribe of Levi, plus the women and children. So here they are to stake their claim on the land. What happens next is, and that's Mount Ebal, the Mount of Cursing, and Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing. But what happens next is they're encamped at Gilgal, and there's a group of people, Canaanites from Gibeon, that make their way to Joshua's camp. Somehow they understood God had given the instructions that to Joshua and his men that you are to make no covenant with the Canaanites. We read that tonight earlier in the scripture reading, to not make covenants with them, to not marry them. The Canaanites were to be put to death. They were to be driven out. But God said, and you'll read this kind of thing in Deuteronomy 20 and related passages, but God says, now, if someone from a distance comes and he wants to make a treaty with you, then you can. So here's what the Gibeonites did. They pretended to have come from a great distance. They had these old worn-out shoes and worn-out clothes and bread that was crusty and moldy. And they came up to the camp, and here they are. You can see just a short distance away. But they said, when Joshua said, where are you from? Oh, we're from a long way off. See these clothes? They were fresh and new when we left. Look at them now. This bread, it was right out of the oven. Look at it now. And here's what the text says. The text says in Joshua chapter 9 that Joshua and the men of Israel, it says that they sampled of their provisions, but they asked not counsel of the Lord. That's always a bad mistake. They asked not counsel of the Lord, and so they entered into covenant relationship with them. Well, they found out they'd been deceived, but they honored their commitment. But here's what happens. In the next chapter, they are attacked by a coalition of Canaanites from the south. I did want to show you this, though. The tell right in the middle, see the terraces, the tell here? This is the city of Gibeon. This is where those people were from. We're looking at it from a distance, and now we go there and we're on the tell that I was just showing you. So this is where those people were. Remember what I said this morning, boys and girls? Are you listening? Remember what I said this morning? When you read in the Bible about a place, it's a real place. Real people. The events are real. So, Gibeonites. So as I started to say, they were attacked by a coalition from the south led by the king of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at this point, let me show you, let's back up, because you think about the whole city of Jerusalem when you hear that word, and the temple, which is let me see here, yeah, on further up here. But see the yellow that I've outlined there? That was the Jerusalem of the days of the judges. About 8 acres, that's all. But anyway, the attack takes place, and Gibeon says, help, we're being attacked. And so Joshua, because of their treaty, they defended the Gibeonites. So what happens is the battle turns, and the coalition started fleeing. They went by the way of Beit Horon, which is right here. And then we read next in the valley of Ayalon, the valley of Aijalon, which is also here in the photograph, and right here on the map is where we're at. You see that? And another view of it right here. But here's the point. In Joshua, the 10th chapter, Joshua prayed to the Lord that the sun would stand still. He asked for more time because he knew if it got dark, these kings to the south would escape. And he asked for more time. And God listened to him, and he gave him more time. And so on that day, the sun stood still, even though it was time for it to be dark. But there was light given, and so the text continues. And it says, for example, as he passed on from Makkedah to Libnah, this is Libnah, that he took that city. That was one of the cities to the south. And another very important one is Lachish, or as they say in Israel, Lachish. And so that also fell, as Joshua chapter 10 continues there at verse 32. And here's what the city looks like from above as you look down. Very important city that was taken. So here's what that means. The central is taken. The southern part of the land is taken. And now Joshua turns his attention to the north at a place called Hatzor. And the reason he does that, the text is going to point out in Joshua 11 verse 10, that Hatzor was formerly the head of all these kingdoms. You see, by taking Hazor, now they have control to the north, the central, the south, and the north. And so that's in chapter 11. And again, in chapter 12, you've just got a summary of all the cities that were taken. A total of 31 are given. And so what happens in the book of Joshua, the first 12 chapters tell of the invasion and the conquest. The last 12 chapters, 13 through 24, of its division among the 12 tribes. And that sounds good. It is good. And what we can do in Joshua chapter 21 is to observe in verse 43 that the Lord gave to Israel all that he sware to give to their fathers. They possessed it and dwelt therein. Verse 45, it all came to pass. Nothing failed. And that really sounds good, and it is good, except God had said, I'm not going to give you all the land all at once, drive out all the Canaanites at once, lest the beast overtake the land, but little by little you shall drive them out. And what they did was to fail to follow through. They did receive the land, but then they didn't continue to follow up on that like they were supposed to. But they certainly received the land, so we can put our check mark there. It's just that when we come to the next book in the Bible, which is the book of Judges, in the first chapter, see, here's the temptation. You want to study the Judges. One of the young ladies tonight said her Judges, all 15 of them. So you want to study the Judges? Okay, let's skip chapters 1 and 2 and get on to chapter 3 and read about Othniel. But see, what happens is the first chapter is really setting you up for what happens. And it's not God that failed, but the people failed to do what God said. For example, Benjamin, we mentioned Jerusalem. Originally, Benjamin took Jerusalem but did not hold on to it. And you're going to read just verse after verse where this sort of thing happens. Manasseh failed to drive out the people living in Beit Shan. And it mentions Ta'anak, Dor, Iblim, Megiddo. And the thing is, all of these are key places. They're strategic places. Ephraim didn't drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer. That's an important city to the south. Zebulun doesn't drive out the inhabitants in their territory. That's in verse 30 of chapter 1. Asher doesn't drive out the residents of Akko, Sidon, Aklav, Akziv, and so forth. They failed to drive them out, the text says. And likewise Naphtali and some places mentioned there, Beit Shemesh, Beit Anat. So what you have is a listing of places that Israel, and some of these places, well, it's like, well, where is that, or what is that, or we don't trouble ourselves to look it up. But if you do, for example, it mentioned Dor. Well, this is Dor, and that's a harbor. Now, if you have territory that has the ocean, the sea as part of its territory, but you don't have your harbor, would you agree you're at a disadvantage? And so they don't have Dor. They lost out on that. But you know, that's not the only one. It also mentioned Akziv. And Akziv, a well-established settlement in ancient times, a station on the great coastal highway. That's the Via Maris. And so here again, this is a harbor city. It's an important city, but it was listed among those that Israel didn't keep. It also mentioned Akko. That's another harbor. In fact, the one that was left is Joppa, and they also lost Joppa. And what that means is Israel didn't have a single harbor. They lost all those. So you take a little bit of time to just see what that's talking about. And it mentioned these strategic cities. For example, Megiddo, right on that international highway. But they lost that too. So the thing is, just by failing to follow up, they put themselves at a real disadvantage because they've not followed up to continue to have full possession of the land. So these enemies are encroaching. And so with that, again, there's more influence of the pagan gods round about. And it sets up this cycle, a 5-stage cycle, where the people will lapse into sin by worshiping these false gods. God will allow an enemy to oppress them, and the people will cry out and ask deliverance, and God will raise up the judge who delivers them, and then there's peace till the judge dies. But are you ready? After he dies, then the children of Israel again did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And that's the period of the judges. That's what happens there. Attracted to the gods round about them. Ashdod, worshipped by the Philistines. This bronze bull was found, of all places, in the heartland of Samaria. Baal was widely worshipped by many of the Israelites, as well as the female counterpart, the Asherim that are often mentioned. This is a god of the Moabites, and again, I should say the Ammonites, and it specifies that they worship those gods as well. So that brings us to the time of the judges. You have Othniel, who delivered Israel from an oppressor from Mesopotamia, whose name was Cushan-Rishathaim. If you're thinking about giving a name to your child, please don't give him that name. Cushan-Rishathaim. It means double wickedness. And there's such a thing as a self-fulfilled prophecy, so you just want to stay away from that. But again, the Moabites suppress Israel. You've got Ehud who delivers them from that. By the time you get to Judges 4 and 5, you've got the Canaanites who have regrouped at Hazor, and there's a battle that takes place here at Mount Tabor. I mentioned that briefly this morning. In the days of Gideon, you've got the Midianites that have encroached upon the land. Some of the judges receive more attention than the others. Gideon receives quite a bit of verses devoted to that account, where he gathers Israel at God's command at the spring of Harod. And here's the situation. The Midianites were encamped in the valley on the north side of the hill of Moreh. Gideon was encamped by God's command at the spring of Harod. And it was here that God said to tell all of Israel that was fearful and afraid that they could leave. And there were only 32,000 to start with, and 22,000 walked off, and that just left 10,000. 135,000 Midianites. So now they're only outnumbered 13.5 to 1. God said, you've still got too many Israelites. So he says, take them down to the spring. And by the way, one of the things that impressed me about being at this location, the spring of Harod is behind us. We're on ground level. The hill of Moreh is before us, and you can just see it so clearly. Again, the Midianites were encamped here, 135,000 of them. Think about at night with those campfires. You think about all those thousands of campfires, all the soldiers milling about. How frightening that would have been. But God said, for you to know that I'm the one that gives you deliverance, you go to the spring at Harod. And those that would bring the water up to their mouth and to drink it from their hand, they would be selected. I found an Israeli that could demonstrate this for us. And 300 did that. The rest got on their knees, put their faces down, and drank with their faces down in the water, and they were eliminated. So with that 300, God brought about deliverance for Israel. But we fast forward to the days of Samson. Samson was born at Zorah. Let me show you where Samson was born. Right there. That's Zorah. So this is the territory of Samson right there. Timnah, the tale of Timnah, this is where he married a woman of the Philistines. And you remember the account of his setting the fields on fire and things like that. But we hasten on. Samson, the strong man who did not control himself. But that's through Judges 16. Judges 17, the whole tribe of Dan migrates to the north. They leave their tribal inheritance. You know, a while ago I said they lost Joppa. So when they left their tribal inheritance, they lost this harbor right here. And they made their way all the way up to the north, to Laish. They conquered those people and they settled there in Dan. And this is why the area will be called from Dan to Beersheba. Because, see, they went all the way there to the north, some of the gates of Dan. And this, by the way, this gate dates back to the time of the patriarchs. The gate of the city of Dan has been excavated and preserved there. But we hasten on. We hasten on to mention that though the book of Judges is done, Ruth 1 and verse 1 says, in the days when the judges ruled, and it tells us about Naomi. It tells us about Ruth. And it tells us about the death of the sons in Naomi's family. And so Ruth left Moab with Naomi to return to Bethlehem of Judah. We're looking across to the hill country of Moab, where Ruth was from. And here we are in Bethlehem. And it would be here that she met and married Boaz. And they had a son named Obed. And when you get to Ruth, the 4th chapter, you suddenly read in verse 18, now these are the generations of Peretz. And see, what God wants you to know, that back in Genesis 38, that Judah had children. He had and Onan and Shelah. But then through Tamar, he also had Peretz and Zerah. And the reason Judges in this period, in the time of Ruth, especially records this narrative is because it becomes the connecting link between Judah's son, Peretz, and traces it all the way to the present character who was Boaz, who begat Obed, who begat Jesse, who begat David. In other words, here's that connecting link as we continue to see that, that Christ was coming into the world. But as we complete this period of the Judges, the tabernacle is at Shiloh. It's been at Shiloh all this time since Joshua chapter 18 places it at Shiloh. This is Shiloh as you make your way up to the site. And as you are there at the site, you can see some of the excavations that have occurred. But something that is of special interest to us is this rectangular area that's been excavated and has been identified as where the tabernacle was. Closer up view there. And so by this time, Eli is serving. Eli is serving as high priest. He's also a judge. Samuel was brought here as a youngster and brought up there serving in the house of the Lord. And so the Judges continues in those opening chapters of 1 Samuel. There's a battle with the Philistines. A battle takes place at Aphek. Aphek. And here's an aerial view of Aphek. This is the area right here. The battle took place here, and the Philistines took the ark. And as they took it from Aphek and various places, the people kept getting plagued. And so they came up with the idea, let's put this on a cart and put a couple of milk cows and tie their calves back and just see what will happen. And those milk cows, those mama cows made a beeline to Beit Shemesh, which is Israelite territory. This is Beit Shemesh. And so the ark was returned. The 5 lords of the Philistines left. And from there the ark was taken to this city, Kiryat Yearim. And it would be there till the time of David. That's 1 Samuel 6 and verse 21. Quickly, we're going to conclude by talking about the United Kingdom period. And this will just be a very brief summary. 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people came to Samuel and said, Samuel, you're getting old. I'm sure he appreciated that. Samuel, you're getting old, and your sons walk not in your ways. Make us a king so we can be like the nations round about us. He was very displeased, but God said, Samuel, they've not rejected you. They rejected me, that I should no longer be king over them. Nevertheless, God selected Saul to be the first king, and Samuel anointed him in chapter 9, and he begins his reign. He was Saul of Gibeah, not to be confused with Gibeon. And what you're seeing here, the high point in the photo right here, high point of elevation, this is Gibeah. This is Saul's home. That's been identified as that site. So it would be from here that he reigned. This is where he lived. He delivered Israel from the threat of Ammon, the men of Jabesh Gilead. And there's also a battle recorded with the Philistines where he acted unwisely and jumped the gun and offered sacrifices before Samuel got there at the appointed time. This is Michmash, the area where that took place in 1 Samuel 14. In 1 Samuel 15, he failed to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And Samuel told Saul that God has rejected you from being king. God also told Samuel to go to the house of Jesse at Bethlehem, and there he was to anoint the next king. And Samuel didn't know who it was, but it turned out it was David that he anointed. God showed him that once he got there. Then in the next chapter, that's where David killed Goliath, the giant of the Philistines, and brought to an end the great threat of the Philistines for the time being there. But instead of being grateful, Saul became very jealous. We're showing you here where that happened. This is Azekah, mentioned in the account of 1 Samuel 17. And the stream, the greenery that you follow there, the creek bed, that's where David selected the 5 stones. He just needed one of them. But this is the scene, the valley of Elah, where David killed, another shot there showing you the valley below, where David killed the giant Goliath. But instead of Saul being grateful, he was insanely jealous. And David would not lift his hand against God's anointed, but instead he would flee from place to place. One of the places that he fled, you see on the western shore, right on the shore of the Dead Sea, is mentioned as En Gedi. And it tells us here that this is one of the places that David and his men would hide from Saul, in the caves of En Gedi. And there's just a lot. It's wilderness area, and there's just a lot of caves there. I don't know which one he would have been in, and by now he has several men that are with him. But again, this is a bad time for David as he's fleeing from Saul. Some of the Psalms were written during this time. At En Gedi, by the way, there's a beautiful waterfall. Actually, there's a series of waterfalls. And so there are places where you can get the necessary water to survive in the wilderness. But finally, David just had to leave Saul's territory, and the Philistines, with whom he allied himself, gave him a city to the south, all for himself and his 600 men, called Ziklag. And this tale has been identified as Ziklag, where David and his men were. And this really brings us to the end of the life of King Saul, because in 1 Samuel 28 and following, here's the situation. Saul and his men are at Mount Gilboa. The Philistines are at Shunem, and they're facing off, and a battle will ensue. In the center there, the white buildings, that is Shunem. That's where the Philistines were. This is Mount Gilboa, where Saul was. The battle took place. Saul and 3 sons of his, including Jonathan, died there. And here we are at the top of Beit Shan, mentioned in 1 Samuel 31. Now we're looking at it from a distance, because it tells us that they decapitated Saul and nailed the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on the walls of this city. And they were rescued, the bodies were rescued by the men of Jabesh Gilead, whom Saul had helped, and they burned those bodies so they could not be further mutilated. But that's very sad. And that's where Saul's reign comes to an end. David's reign, first 7 years at Hebron, and then 33 years at Jerusalem. And one of the things he did, for which he's noted, is to move the ark from Kiryat Yearim. He moved that to Jerusalem. And so he moved the Ark of the Covenant there. It had been there all that time in the days of Saul, and now the Ark was moved to Jerusalem. Another important thing that happens in the days of David is the Messianic promise. The Messiah and his kingdom, that's going to be through the seed of David, and I'm just going to mention that in the passing there. One other thing about David, and that is the time that he let down his guard when his forces were besieging Rabbath Ammon, and David committed the sin of adultery with Bathsheba at home. And he repented of that. He was forgiven of that. But there were many, many terrible consequences that took place. One other thing I want to tell you about David that's narrated in 2 Samuel chapter 23. And this refers to an earlier time, maybe when he was first king, when the Philistines were still a threat. Maybe even before that. It doesn't tell you when. But David's men were with him. He's in the cave of Adullam. He's shut off there. Notice the direction to the east to Bethlehem. That's 12 miles away from the cave of Adullam. So here David is. This is Tel Adullam. And here he is there with his men. And the text says he is shut up. He's confined to this area. The Philistines have the upper hand. And he says, oh, I wish that someone would get me some water from the well that is by the gate at Bethlehem. Bethlehem was David's home. He wasn't commanding that. It's just, wouldn't that be nice? And so leaving Adullam, where we're standing here, making their way, 3 of his men immediately left the cave. And the text tells us in 2 Samuel 23 that they broke through the host of the Philistines, that the garrison that was stationed at Bethlehem. They drew the water, they made their way back, and they presented the water to David. And he was so moved he could not drink it. He poured it out as a drink offering to the Lord. That happened here at Adullam. And it so much illustrates the concept of devotion and loyalty that these men had to David. And oh, if we could have that kind of devotion to the Lord, just to know what he wants and to do whatever it takes to do that, that's a wonderful thing. By the way, I took this photo from inside the cave of Adullam that is mentioned there at that location. On Solomon, Solomon is known for 4 things. He's known for his wisdom. The Queen of Sheba traveled 1,000 miles to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And when she got there, she said, the half has not been told. But people came from all over to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Secondly, he's known for his works, such as the temple. He was 7 years in building the temple, but also fortress cities, such as Megiddo, such as Gezer. By the way, don't say Gezer. Gezer is an old man. But Gezer is the name of the place there. This is Gezer in the distance in the center there, the highest point there. And here we are at the high point, and you can see some standing stones there at Gezer, as well as the 6-chambered gate which Solomon used in all these fortress cities. That's a boundary stone of Gezer. Thirdly, he's known for his wealth. He had navies of ships that went in the Mediterranean, that went down the Red Sea, and they brought all manner of gold and merchandise, and so he continued to accumulate great wealth. Finally, he's known for his wives. He married women of whom the Lord had said they were not to marry, and that would bring about his downfall. As 1 Kings 11 says, they turned away his heart from following his God. Well, you've been patient with me tonight. We've covered a lot of ground. And that's where we're going to stop with the death of Solomon. What happened is the kingdom divided. It's an exciting time and it's a sad time to read what happened after that. A lot of ups and downs, a lot of lessons to be learned, but we'll reserve that for the study tomorrow evening. I want to suggest to you that as you hear the gospel preached, that Jesus is calling, and you're invited to come. And we invite you this evening, if you're not yet a child of God, to make your way to the front and let us help you. If you need to be restored back to the Lord and prayers on your behalf, again, we would be glad to help you in any way as to